phrases it as being a kind of mythological anticipation of what turns out to be true for him metaphysically. All right, so the fact that there are many gods, but that they are ordered in the sense of there's a hierarchy, as it were, of gods, and there's a chief among them, the most powerful one, Zeus. That's the poetic analog of the fact that the prime mover is one of many, but he is the most powerful. He is the highest level of energy within that genus. All right, and then at the bottom of that page, which I won't read through because we really just pointed it out, time and motion are eternal. May strike us as kind of paradoxical, but it isn't. That is, it isn't for the Greeks. It certainly isn't for Aristotle, right? So in other words, there is no beginning and there is no end. There is motion, there is time, there is change, but there's no beginning and end to the totality of motion, time, and change. All right, and as I point out at the top of page 3, now one of Aristotle's other prejudices, since time and change and motion are manifestations of what you could say ontologically is potentiality, and the reality of anything is its actuality, right? Then potentiality is a kind of deficient state of actuality, and therefore the ideal being, of which the concrete instance would be divine being, is going to be being which is nothing but actuality, right? Actuality doesn't have to be absolute in the modern sense of the word, right? There can be many perfectly actual beings in a genus, okay? But each of them, which you see is no problem, because the only real beings are individual beings. So not only can there be a multiplicity of perfectly actual beings, but that each of them can be so as an each, as a this instance, you see, you could say kind of Platonic terms, perfectly self-sufficient in being, you see, not in that sense dependent on another being for being. And by the way, it helps if there's nothing but eternal being, then there's no need to try and account for the coming into being of these perfectly self-sufficient beings by definition, right?
So now, in the thinking now occurring, God would not qualify as the prime mover.
Well, I'm not sure when you say not qualified.
Well, he had a potentiality, obviously, didn't he?
No. Who?
God, in the thinking now occurring. He became man. He became something. Became man.
Oh, and that's another question. I'm not sure I want to say that he had a potentiality.
Well, how did he become something?
I want to say that he wasn't. I want to say, relying upon the influence of Plotinus on Augustine and Thomas, that the God who became man was otherwise than actuality. He was other than actual and other than potential. Thomas's way of putting that is that he is actus purus, he is pure act, in a way which transcends the Aristotelian distinction between actual and potential.
So whatever he became, it was an illusion then. Didn't become anything, he just
it's a non-sequitur effect.
Became himself. Became what he always was.
No, he became something that he wasn't. He became a human being.
Right. And he didn't have the potential to become a human being.
No, he didn't need potential because he's omnipotent. You only need potential if you're not omnipotent. Or you only need not to have potential if you're omnipotent.
And you can't change, you can't become anything. If you can become anything, but you don't need potential to become that thing.
If you're the creator of the world ex nihilo, you don't need any potential. And the fact that you have no potential doesn't prevent you from doing anything you want.
Let me write this down for I lose it. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. Now okay. So on page 3, there's the classic definition of the divine mind. About a third of the way down in Aristotle's Metaphysics, 1072b, maybe it's a quarter of the way down, 1072b on page 3, thought thinks itself through participation, this is the translation, through participation in the object of thought, for it becomes an object of thought by the act of apprehension and thinking, so that thought and the object of thought are the same. Now, in the Greek, in other words, reading that a little more closely, auton would be what's being called the same. I would rather say the identical thing is to know, and the mind, the knowing, are identical. Kata metalexin, according to the, I think he uses the word participation, which literally is okay, through a participation in the thing known. Okay. Now, if you break down participation, metalepsis, it means a form of well, we have it in our English version of participation, partaking. We say we partake in something, we take part in it, right? So it has that connotation of a kind of partaking in. So the mind, the divine mind, takes part in the object, right? Another translation of this could be communion, right? The relationship could be understood as a kind of communion, a kind of common sharing in common, so to speak, of a substance. Then he says, and this is the famous, one of the famous parts of this definition, it becomes, in the translation, it becomes an object of thought. Novitas Gignitai, that is, becomes that. Now here's what I want to focus on. Theganon kai naon. Theganon is the Greek word for touching, right? Or what I'm calling contact, right? So Aristotle, when he tries to zero in on the act of knowledge of the divine mind, he resorts to the notion of touching. The divine mind partakes of its object by a kind of touching, a kind of contact, you say? And it's that, so you could say, in a sense, I partake, I take part in the table by touching it, right? And at that, the key point here is that at that point of touching, the partaking, whatever, I cannot distinguish the felt from the feel. I can't distinguish knower and known. Sorry. So this is I think is as close as we can get to Aristotle's giving us some concrete sense of what he has in mind when he says that the knower and the known are identical. Right? They are identical in the manner of this, in the manner of contact, in the manner of touching. All right. And so I say, here is the heart of Aristotle's understanding of the actuality of knowing and being known. For man, the potential knower of all things, knowing occurs when it is identically the essence of the known. This act of knowing, all right, so human knowing, now here's the point, qua actual act of knowledge. Qua act of knowledge is a divine something or other. Qua act of knowledge, the mind, at the level of its actual act of knowing, is like the divine mind by itself, so to speak. It's identical with the known. It somehow or other is in contact with the known, but this to reason, you see, is what reason remembers afterwards it was to be that thing. You say there's no immediate grasp by reason of its own actualization. You could say that the actualization of reason takes place beyond itself in Aristotle. See? And so when I talk about the transcendental form of reason, right? So then I would call, I think somewhere I do call that a kind of transcendent form of natural reason, if I could put it that way, right? Looking backwards to Aristotle. In Aristotle, the form of natural reason is transcendent. You say? That is, understand, transcendent to itself, and in a certain sense transcendent to itself. Whereas in the transcendental form, what we're saying is that contact, if you want to put it that way, which however is now going to be modified by Thomas, be through an intelligible species which he understands to be a likeness of the thing itself, is nevertheless going to be transparent. It's not going to be a black box. It's not going to transcend reason. Reason is going to be, how shall I put it? It's a little too strong, but give the idea, as it were, self-possessed in the act of knowledge. It's going to understand itself to be identical with its object in a way that maintains the distinction between itself and its object, and that's the function of likeness in Thomas. You see, likeness, when he considers, he knows that Descartes is coming. He feels it in his bones. It's going to be a few hundred years, but he feels it coming, and Thomas says, well, maybe somebody could say that what I'm saying is solipsistic, right? In other words, maybe this is the mind knowing itself, right? I mean, right? This is Descartes' problem. Thomas deals with that right off the bat. No. We know that the intelligible species, the mind knows the intelligible species to be the likeness of something other than itself. Therefore, it knows that there is something other than itself, right? In other words, so likeness is a two-edged sword for Thomas, right? In other words, in knowing the object through its likeness, it knows that it's not it and its object are something else, and that's the beginning of this notion that we call intentionality, right? All right, Aristotle knows nothing of that. All right, he's into contact, right? And in that sense, in contact, we have a kind of transcendence, a kind of darkness, as it were, a kind of what I elsewhere call opaqueness in Aristotle's understanding of from a human point of view, from a rational point of view, there's a moment of opaqueness, which ironically, the opacity occurs precisely at the moment that the act of knowledge is, you say? But that experience is opaque to the reason, right? And we said last term, I guess, by analogy, it's very interesting that in Plotinus, there's a certain kind of transcendence of nous in the one. Yeah? So that Plotinus gives us a kind of cosmic or metacosmic view of a kind of Aristotelian psychology writ large, right? That there's something above and beyond mind. It's not exactly the same, but it's an analog, right? There's something above and beyond that second God, that second God that in some sense escapes that second God, which nevertheless is, as Plotinus is going to tell us in today's assignment, when we get there, is that first God, which is the act of the knowing that is the second God. Okay? So Plotinus on a whole other scale captures a real analog to this problem in Aristotle.
Yeah. In both cases, the moment of contact is a kind of darkness vis-a-vis the kind of knowledge that occurs at the next level down.
Yes, that's right. Okay, fair enough, right. So another way of understanding by anticipation the transcendental form of natural reason in Thomas Aquinas, which sets in really with Augustine, I mean not that particular form, but the movement, is a kind of, what I said in different contexts, but put it in this context, a collapse between it, right? So now the act of knowing, which was above and beyond, and kind of a darkness to the lower level, that all takes place integrally at the one identical level, right? So the act of knowledge does not escape what otherwise would have been the secondary form of knowing, right? In the human case, reason. All right. All right. So then I think I make here, so in the bottom half of this page 3, maybe about 2/3 of the way down, I say before and after the act of knowledge, both the knower and the known are such potentially, not actually. Now this is particularly talking about the human act of knowing, right? So in other words, for Aristotle, it's the old trick about if the tree falls in the woods, doesn't make a sound, right? The Aristotelian answer to that is potentially. Now that may not be very satisfying, but that's the real answer. In other words, of course, potentially it makes a sound, but it doesn't actually make a sound unless it's heard. Right? Generalize. That which I sense, when I'm not sensing it, is potentially sensible. And when I'm not sensing anything, which may not ever actually happen, but let's say consciously, when I'm not sensing something, I am potentially a sensor, you see? When I actually sense something, using contact as a kind of paradigm now, but it would apply mutatis mutandis of the other senses. Because remember, Aristotle says the most fundamental sense is touch. It's another nice touch of his. That's nice. Now I think of quantity, and there's got to be a relation to it. Okay, so yes, there are a number of senses for Aristotle, but the most fundamental one is touch. Okay, so when actually sense, I'll use his guide. When I actually touch something, my actual touching, and the table's actually being touched, that's when that happens. Now the table is potentially touched, and now I'm potentially touching the table, right? So the point I'm making is that's so clear to Aristotle because that makes perfect sense, and he has no reason to doubt it. Why would he doubt it? Okay, that's his experience. Right? Now, however, what I'm saying at the bottom of the page, that Aristotle found it particularly appropriate to use the analogy to sensible contact in describing the eternal actuality of the divine knowing itself, provides us an insight into how unintelligible Descartes' doubt would have been to Aristotle. The latter, Aristotle, cannot doubt the existence of a sensible world, which is not actual apart from its being sensed by senses, which themselves are not actual apart from the act of sensing in which that world is grasped. There's just no problem. Do you see? Now, that's right. In other words, Descartes' world or his problem presupposes, you know what he does? This is interesting. In effect, what he does, he sets up the whole modern project, of course, but what's really going on in Aristotelian terms? Descartes is assuming that what for Aristotle, the actuality of which cannot be in doubt is because what is the external world is potentially, it's a potential. It's not, I can't doubt the actuality unless I'm in contact with it. When I'm in contact with it, I actually experience it, so I can't doubt it. Right? So what I'm getting at is that, in effect, modernity is a kind of very interesting move in which potentiality, or what would be merely potential in Aristotle's world, takes on a kind of actuality.
Yeah, the idea is that, in fact, that's this whole issue of positivism, is how to banish potentiality from the description of the physical world.
Right.
Yes, I mean that's the whole idea, is that you want to get rid of modalities. You don't want possibility. You don't want that there should be anything that's potential. And the whole headache of quantum physics is that suddenly potentiality comes back into space.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now I'm linking this in with other things that we've discussed there. Christian faith in the transubstantiation of the Eucharist has not yet sown a seed of doubt concerning the actual identity of the substantiality of the sensible and its being sensed. For Aristotle, the sensing of the world is the substantial actuality of the sensible world. In time before, in actuality beyond, all doubt and certainty. Right? So the basic premise here, zeroed in on the transubstantiation idea, is that not only does the transubstantiation lead the scientific mind of Aquinas to explain appearances independently of substance, setting up the Kantian move, you see. But before Kant, it is already introduced, in principle, a radical doubt as to the reliability of my senses. If I believe this is not bread and wine, but my senses tell me it is, right? Well, as a believer, I have no problem because I just believe it. But as a scientist, I gotta think about that for 102 years, and I think, well, wait a minute, now maybe I can't trust my senses. My senses obviously are not.
You could say
they cannot be taken at face value.
The entire world of physics is the continuous, again and again, confirmation of changes in the substance without changes in the accident. Because in spite of the empirical basis of modern science, the actual empirical condition of modern science is that nothing is perceivable. Everything is beyond what you perceive. The DNA, that's a structure in a goo, the atomic physics, everything is something that's beyond perceptibility. So we live in a world which is like the world of transubstantiation, in the sense that the substances are constantly changing outside of our ability to perceive them.
Okay.
We only have the construction of the actuality of the substances, which is a mental construction, not something that's perceived.
Well, okay, I think that there might be areas in science where that is currently true, but I don't think DNA is a good example, because you can see, in effect, the structure of DNA.
Well, I mean, on a microscope.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Well, there are different degrees of it, but
okay.
But the basic thing is that if you start, I'm just sort of like unfolding. If you start with the doubt that's created by transubstantiation, that it might be the case that our senses do not give us a true report of the substance of the world. You start with that. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, you've opened up a universe in which the whole thing might be like that.
Yes,
And
yes,
so you
that's
need
right.
microscopes
Right.
in order to get some information about what's going on. You can no longer. So
Right.
that
Well, I mean, I think Descartes' out and Kant's follow-through would be a kind of a generalization, and I think we're saying this on another level all through the thinking now occurring, that really modern scientific attitude is a kind of generalization of faith. That's the irony, or the implications of faith. Right? In other words, it takes. This would not have been a problem when the Eucharist was in the tabernacle in the corner of the church or in the front of the church. When this issue was confined, you see, to
a special case.
to a peculiarly special case that was grounded in miracle. So in that sense, Descartes, despite Peirce, he's consistent with his culture, right? In other words, when he comes to an insoluble problem of the unity of body and soul, he attributes it to a miracle, in effect. Okay, and to that extent, he's not all the way along, right? But once you demystify the situation or generalize the situation, then you've raised questions, right? Which nevertheless begin with taking seriously the faith. That's the point.
But in the scientific, from a scientific point of view, nobody's gotten beyond Descartes.
Are you saying that historically or autobiographically that the transubstantiation was what nudged Descartes into this new touchstone?
Well, I was about to say I think that's part of it.
Is that accurate in terms?
Well,
of
I don't know that he says that.
Personal history.
I don't. To the best of my recollection, he doesn't say that. So I'm understanding why he had the problem he did.
Because historically, the only thing that evolved in the history of thought that would have
I was about to say
was the transubstantiation.
I was about to say. Also, one of the problems that Aristotle doesn't have is that he's got an eternal universe. So he has no doctrine that tells him, as Thomas articulates it, that there is a Novitas Mundi, that there's a first moment, a first now. Thomas says, we believe there's a first now, but you cannot demonstrate it because he read his Aristotle. It's contradictory, or it certainly can't be demonstrated. I'll be more careful to quote him. Cannot be demonstrated, can't be proven. I guess you could assert it. But so what I'm getting at is the whole worldview, of which transubstantiation would be a kind of very intimate, particular instance. The whole worldview was that if I take seriously the fact that the world didn't always exist, that it came into being out of nowhere. Well, many people have had this anxiety, by the way. Well, if that's true, if I really believe that, what's to prevent it from disappearing anytime it feels like, right? In other words, it
Feels like.
Only Ray Bradbury.
Okay, but the point now, of course, built into the theology is that the assurance that God wouldn't pull a trick like that, right? That having created, He's going to maintain it, right? But nevertheless, the basic idea was that my whole universe doesn't have that kind of security in being, if I can put it that way, that it had in an Aristotelian context. Add to that, a few other things like the incarnation, transubstantiation, and so on. I got all of these things which I'm taking with utter seriousness, right? Western civilization becomes Christianized. All the best minds for 1,000 or more years, right? Right up into the scientific age. All those early scientists, 9 out of 10 of them were monks, okay? These were people whose whole worldview was a deep, serious commitment to the truths of faith, and they were scientists. So at some point, there's going to be an effect of their faith on their scientific attitude, right? And you see it already in Thomas, and I think you see it in Descartes. So it's a more. I'm making a more generalized statement. It's not based on anything that Descartes said.
I think the history, to actually, if you wanted to unparse the entire history, you'd have to look at alchemy. The history of alchemy in relationship to the history of transubstantiation would give you the details of this, where you could actually see it working itself out, because there is some kind of a connection there. I couldn't spell it out.
All right. All right. Well, I want to get to Plotinus before the clock runs on us. On page 5, at the bottom paragraph, Plotinus writes in the Enneads, quote, "Thus we have one identical principle, the intellect, which is the universe of authentic beings, the truth." All right, so notice in terms of the reference I made earlier to Plato and the Republic, the intellect, the nous, the secondary God, as we'll find out in a moment, is the realm of beings and the realm of truth, right? So, and in Plato, beyond that is the idea of the good, which is beyond being and truth. Beyond this intellect, the nous, in Plotinus, analogously, is the one. All right. As such, it is a great God, or better, not a God among gods, but the Godhead entire. It is a God, but notice now, a secondary God, manifesting before there is any vision of that other, the supreme which rests over all, enthroned in transcendence upon that splendid pediment, the nature following close upon it, unquote. The transcendent one is that which works to the establishment of real being. In Aristotle, the divine mind, the eternal knowing, which is the active knowing of the act of knowing, is the life, which is the energy of the mind, which I referred to before. In Plotinus, the one is the energy producing the hypostasis of being. The highest form of which being is the now secondary God, whose compensation for the demotion is to include within itself all other intellectual beings. All right, so another thing I'm pointing out here, or trying to, is that when, remember, this is part of the problem in Aristotle. Hegel's problem in Aristotle, it was, by the way, Plotinus' problem in Aristotle. Plotinus complains about this in the Ennead someplace. What I've called in Novitas Mundi Aristotle's particularity, right? He just doesn't bring it all together. He doesn't feel any need to, right? Okay, as long as it's an orderly, intelligible arrangement, that's all we need, says Aristotle. That's all I need as a scientist, as a knower of a world that I'm experiencing. That's all I need. Lose the term I thought here. Okay, so when Plotinus raises the one above the divine nous, he doesn't just raise the one above the divine nous, but a corollary, a consequence of that is that divine nous, that had nothing beyond it in Aristotle, was one among many. But those many, as I was saying from a totally different angle a couple of moments ago, were all independent, as it were, beings, right? In other words, they were not really, they didn't depend for their actuality on the actuality of the greatest of their kind. They were all, and that's why there's trouble, by the way, on Mount Olympus, right? Because even though Zeus is the most powerful god, I mean, hey, I'm Apollo. Who are you? You know what I'm saying? In other words, so they had an irreducible dignity as gods and goddesses. You see what I'm saying? So they could brawl because it wasn't like they depended for their being, right? And so they didn't confuse their accidental differences with their essential equality with Zeus, right? And that creates trouble.
But in Wagner, by the way, the fact that they all go down because they don't respect the structure.
Okay. Don't get me all right. Okay.
Right?
The point I want to make here is that, so the real point is that in Aristotle, not only is the nous, in the sense of prime mover, the chief god, but he has other deities beside him, so to speak, that have an equality in being, if not in degree of being, if I can put it that way. Okay. But they're, in that sense, they're outside of him. You see, they're not included. There's no unification. Right? Aristotle says in this issue of genus versus species, right, that if there were a one of a kind, which he rules out, right, then any others would have to be that one. And Aristotle says that's absurd, right? Yeah. Okay. So when Plotinus raises the one above the chief god, just say the secondary god in his view, then he's Aristotelian enough to incorporate all the other beings at the level of divinity within that one. So that one now becomes the unified whole. And in that sense, you see, Aristotle would object, but in that sense, you see, the secondary god becomes a kind of one of a kind, right? Although, right, a one of a kind that includes, in a way which would bother Aristotle, all the other ones that in Aristotle would be outside of that god, right? So now the point of this that the raising of the one is not just an attitude problem or an altitude problem, right? It's not an attitude problem, but the raising of the one, and this goes back to flattening out the pyramid, flattening out the hierarchy, to a kind of series of concentric circles in some sense, right? That the point being that the widest circle here is the one, right? That everything is included in it. It's a kind of paradox of circles, right? So the most indiscernible whatever in Plotinus is the most comprehensive, right? And the first discernible, but less discernible, let's say, than the physical world, the nous, is inside that circle. You see, and the soul would be inside that, and nature would be inside of that, and so forth, and so on down. So as the circle gets smaller, right, in a certain sense, I'm going down, even though on a pyramidical sense, as I go down, the base gets wider. So it's the same. It's just a reflection of yeah. Okay. All right. So. All right, so the other intellect, in emanating from the one, the all so in other words, now the divine mind, which in Aristotle had a very modest role as the chief among equals, if I put it in Homeric terms, you see. In emanating from the one, the all-encompassing divine mind has become a product of the producer, the form of all things emanating from the absolutely formless one. So that divine mind now becomes the all-encompassing of being and truth. It is all beings and truth. And Plotinus says in the next paragraph, this produced reality is an ideal form, for certainly nothing springing from the supreme can be less, and it is not a particular form, but the form of all, besides which there is no other. All right, so it is unique. It is, in the language we've been developing here, one of a kind. It follows that the first must be without. It follows that the first, the one, must be without form, and if without form, then it is no being. Being must have some definition and therefore be limited, but the first cannot be thought of as having definition and limit, for thus it would not be the source, but the particular item indicated by the definition assigned to it. If all things belong to the produced, which of them can be thought of as the supreme? Not included among them, this can be described only as transcending them. But they are being and the beings. Here you can see, I guess, the root of Heidegger's ontological difference. It therefore transcends being. All right. Okay.
I mean, this
Yeah.
you've got to do all day to spend on being and beings there.
Okay.
Because up above, you just switches. When you say first must be without form, and without form, then it is no being. Being must have some definition. It's a being that must have some definition, and it's not clear why being doesn't have to have a definition. Must have a definition. And
Well, it may not be clear, but it's clear to Plotinus, right?
in that moment, except if you actually go on with these paragraphs, they get less clear as he goes on, and he has his own caveats about what he just said.
Okay.
I mean, he's going to say, I'm talking about what can't be spoken about.
Okay.
And I'm doing that only because I'm trying to indicate something for myself, because I need to do that for what is clearly a purpose of contemplation.
Okay. Well, all right.
I mean, that's not the holy hush of a pious relationship to the unspeakable. It's almost a technical point about where you've gotten to the extremity of what can be said.
Okay. Well, I want to make another point here. That is to say, notice that in distinguishing the one from the nous, the reason he wants to distinguish it here is he wants to distinguish the one as without limit from the nous, which has got to have limit and form and definition in order to be intelligence and therefore intelligibility per se, you see. And so when we talk about this collapse of the two levels in Christian theology, where the creator God is an intelligence, then that intelligence is going to have the quality of the Plotinian one, which is unlimitedness. You see, it's not just be an intelligence, but it's going to be an infinite intelligence, or as I put it simply, it's infinite reason, as it turns out. Okay, and therefore the human reason over against that in Christian thought is going to be the finite, and you can see this working both in Descartes, right, in the Meditations. All right, he's a finite thinker, he says, and God is an infinite thinker, and in Hegel, right, the human spirit is the finite addition of the divine spirit. So what I'm getting at is that Plotinus has a notion of unlimitedness, of infinity, but he explicitly disassociates it from intelligence, from intellect, from nous. You see? Whereas Christianity explicitly identifies the two. So the identification of the one and intellect, a little more, flesh it out a little more, is that now the intelligence that comprehends all things is without limit. Right? There is in the Plotinus already an intelligence that comprehends all things, all beings. He's already said that. You see? But it ain't the infinity of the one. So now we have an intelligence that comprehends all beings and it's infinite. Well, I think the universe is going to start expanding.